So, Chapter 12 of Two Blue Vortex is officially out. Or I should say 75% of the pages have been translated into English in the leaks that I'm currently reading. Yeah, to give you a little peek behind the curtain here, only 75% of the chapter that I'm currently reading has been translated, but I'm anticipating somewhere in the middle of this video that we'll get the last 10 pages. So currently, at the beginning of this video, I actually don't know how Chapter 12 ends. Exactly. I mean, I got the pictures, I just don't have the words. But even with only being able to read 75% of this chapter, I can tell you Chapter 12 is absolutely massive. See, Chapter 12 not only has one of the longest fights we've seen in Two Blue Vortex up until this point, with the likes of Sarada, Konohamaru, and Boruto all battling it out against Hidari, but it also revealed to us how the Shinju are able to heal themselves after incurring what seemed to be fatal wounds. On top of that, we also learned that the Shinju appeared to have a core of some kind. And outside of anatomical findings about the Shinju, we also got some confirmation that Boruto's flying Raijin might work a bit differently than we originally anticipated. We got a full exposition breakdown on how Rasengan Uzuhiko works, and I'm still kind of lost if I'm being honest. And to finish the chapter off, Boruto took the first bit of damage he's taken in the entirety of Two Blue Vortex, and it's not looking good for him. Tie that all into another touching reunion between Kawaki and Boruto, and yeah, we have an action-packed chapter ahead of us. And while this chapter might have seemed relatively straightforward, as about 25 or 30 of the pages are dedicated to the battle against Hidari, there are definitely some nuances in this chapter that need pointing out and explaining. And, oh yeah, this chapter panned out in the exact way that I believed it would. And thus, there's some theories that need elaborating on. And thus, today we're talking Chapter 12 of Two Blue Vortex, Explained. But before we get to explaining anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you guys want to hear me do breakdowns on your other favorite manga, go ahead and follow my other channel, The Weeb Commander, where instead of talking about Naruto and Boruto, I talk all other anime and manga. Or if you want to see me try to bring real-life challenges to the anime world, go ahead and follow my brand new channel that I created with Danny Mata, Stephen He, and Chris Barnett, called Anime IRL. Or if you just want to hear me talk about anime and manga, go ahead and follow my anime podcast, Talkers Anonymous, where me and Danny Mata break down everything that happened in anime this week. It's available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. But before we get into all that, today we've got to talk about our favorite recurring sponsor to the page, ExpressVPN. ExpressVPN is the only VPN option for me. Whether it's when I'm traveling in China and don't have access to my regular apps, or sitting at home hoping to browse the Japanese Netflix catalog or the Brazilian Amazon Prime catalog, ExpressVPN helps me in a myriad of different ways every single day. See, as many of you know, I'm a big-time One Piece fan and I've been watching it recently. However, seasons 22 through 38 aren't available on US Netflix. However, if I use ExpressVPN to pop on over to Japan, they become available immediately. All I gotta do is turn on my VPN, refresh Netflix, and boom, I have all of One Piece at my fingers. ExpressVPN also keeps me protected while I'm surfing the internet. And they do so by encrypting and rerouting all of my data through their secure servers, which keeps my browsing activity private and out of the hands of my internet service provider or would-be hackers. And when you have to trudge through some of the deepest and darkest parts of the internet to find the truly greatest anime theories the internet has to offer, then being protected is pretty big. Not to mention ExpressVPN allows for me to have every single one of my devices attached to my account for no additional charge. So no matter where I'm scrolling, whether it's my phone, my work computer, or my 2 laptops, I'm protected. So what are you waiting for? There's literally no better VPN option out there than ExpressVPN. So go to expressvpn.com/nzhammer to get your first 3 months of ExpressVPN completely free. Or simply just follow the link in my description or my pinned comment. ExpressVPN is offering you safety and more anime. How could you say no to that? So, Chapter 12 presented to us 40 pages of wall-to-wall action. Whether it was Sarada and Boruto's close-up and personal battle against Hidari, or Kishimoto rather topically having Jura become a sniper from miles away to take out Boruto and Sarada, in terms of action, this chapter absolutely delivered. However, the chapter wasn't so wrapped up in its own action that it forgot to provide to us exposition, because Chapter 12 has also answered a lot of the lingering questions that we had in Two Blue Vortex, like how the Shinju work, and how Rasengan Uzuhiko works. And while the explanations are still currently pretty basic, it's better than anything we had up until this point. On top of that, all of this exposition has helped either build up old theories or corroborated them. But before we get to talking about theories, we should talk about what happened in the chapter. So, let's get into it. Chapter 12 picks up exactly where Chapter 11 left off, with Boruto standing between Hidari and Sarada. And as Boruto stares down Hidari, Sarada gasps and says, "Boruto?" as Sumire and Konohamaru look on. I do think, by the way, before we move on, it's rather fitting that Boruto flew in to save Sarada, and not Sumire. Yes, I know, Hidari's trying to consume Sarada and not Sumire, but still, they were both electrocuted, and Boruto just happened to pop in when Sarada was in trouble. It could mean nothing, but it might mean something. Boruto then places Himawari on the ground next to Sarada and yells at Konohamaru to keep an eye on her. Now, this confuses Konohamaru because so far as Konohamaru knows, Boruto is a nefarious villain, and thus his response to Boruto telling him to take care of Himawari has basically been Konohamaru's response to anything important in Boruto whatsoever. Nothing. He's not a useful character. However, Hidari, unlike Konohamaru, is a man of action. A tree? A tree of action? Whatever, he's a thing of action. As Hidari immediately turns his hand into a blade, much akin to how Kawaki's able to turn his arms into blades, and lunges at Boruto. However, Boruto, rather fittingly, unsheathes Sasuke's sword and uses it to deflect the blade. We then get a close-up on Boruto's hands as he's making a hand sign with one hand. Now, mind you, being able to weave an ninjutsu with only one hand is something that only the likes of Minato, Sasuke, and Naruto can do. I mean, there is obviously other characters outside of Minato, Naruto, and Sasuke, but it is substantially more difficult to weave a ninjutsu with one hand than it is with two. And thus being able to do so implies that you have some of the highest chakra control in the entire universe. And while that kind of thing shouldn't be all that surprising based off everything we know about Boruto up until this point, it's still the first time we've seen him do it. But what ninjutsu is Boruto weaving, you ask? Well, that'd be none other than wind-style breakthrough. And to some of you, that might just be, just another wind-style jutsu. Who cares? And to others, you might be thinking, oh, well, I guess he's finally picking up his father's affinity for wind release, even though he's basically always used it. If you guys will remember, in the early parts of Boruto, one of the only moves he had was creating two shadow clones and then having them use wind release to fire him. But wind-style breakthrough is a different wind release jutsu than Boruto used to use. And that's because wind-style breakthrough is a very specific jutsu only used by two people. Those two people being Mitsuki and Orochimaru, which for me is all the confirmation that I need that Boruto is working with Orochimaru in some capacity. Because to my memory, which albeit is flawed sometimes, Mitsuki never taught Boruto this jutsu, and while there is a possibility that he stole it from Mitsuki in some capacity, I believe this is Kishimoto's way of once again hinting who Boruto's been with over the last couple of years. And not only that, but I believe Boruto using this jutsu in the way that he's using it plays into the law of three, as Boruto is now in Two Blue Vortex used three jutsus that are not his, but do tie back to very famous and very powerful people. And I believe every single one of these instances has been to tell us who Boruto's been working with. But that's a whole theory in itself, and you know how these manga review videos go. And thus, if you want to hear more about this law of three and who Boruto might be working with, follow the page and hit the noti bell, because it's gonna be a whole separate video that comes out What's today? Today's Wednesday. It'll come out Sunday. Anyways, after landing a breakthrough directly into Hidari's chest, Hidari uses this opportunity in the distance generated by being blown back to hop into a claw mark. And just like they were fighting a shark in the middle of the ocean, everybody involved in the battle against Hidari began to scan the ground, not knowing exactly where he would pop up from next. We then cut to Kawaki and Delta, who have now made it to Jura's location, as after all, Kawaki was trying to save Himawari, and Himawari was at Jura's location until a second ago. Kawaki then says out loud that Boruto's location changed in a split second. It must have been space-time ninjutsu. Right now, he's probably in the spot where Team 10's encounter started, which is exactly where he is, Jura and Hidari's initial location. But when they get to Himawari's previous location, they see that Jura is just standing in the middle of a desert. And Delta's staring down at him, saying, I don't see Himawari anywhere, and Team 10 is gone as well. She then checks in with the sensory unit and asks if they're all right, which is a really good question, because if you can't see any traces of them and you can't find their chakra signatures, then that is slightly alarming. The sensory unit then tells Delta that Team 10 is heading back to Konoha with their wounded, and that Himawari was able to rendezvous with Sarada and Konohamaru, but Boruto was also there. Delta then says to Kawaki, well, there you have it. What are you gonna do about that? But Kawaki's too entranced, possibly by Jura's eyes or his rippling abs, because instead of answering Delta's question, he just says, that bastard, he's just standing there, what is he planning? Apparently, as we learn later in this chapter, it's much akin to something that happened very recently in our world. So the only conclusion to draw from that is that Kishimoto was in on it. I'm sorry, It's just the truth. As your resident Kishimoto whisperer, I know. Then cut back to Boruto, Sarada, Sumire, Konoha Maru, Himawari, and the sensory unit guy who realized that they're surrounded by claw marks, which isn't great when Hidari, one of the strongest people in the universe, can pop out from any of those claw marks. But Konohamaru, continuing on his rampage of being completely irrelevant in Boruto's story, decides that now is the time to have a conversation with Boruto about what he's up to. As he says, Boruto, what do you think you're doing, coming in and out of Konoha so nonchalantly? Don't you understand your position here? And his sensibility immediately gets checked by a 15-year-old girl who tells him, Konohamaru, stop, what do you think would have happened to me if he didn't come? Which once again, shuts him right up, until he decides to switch to exposition dumping to the person who knows more about Shinju and claw grimes than he does by a Texas mile. As he tells Boruto, be careful, it seems as though Code is able to manipulate claw grimes to do his bidding, and we have no idea where they're gonna pop up. Hey, Konohamaru, I got a hint for you. It's probably the claw marks. Boruto then answers by saying, yeah, that's what it seems like. I mean, sure, Boruto was fighting against these claw grimes 2 whole years ago with Sasuke, but yeah, I mean, just let Konohamaru feel good about himself. Boruto then turns to the sensory unit guy, who refuses to be named, and tells him to sense any claw grime chakra that gets even remotely close to them, telling him to not even let the slightest trace of chakra slip by him. Now he, who shall not be named, says, how dare you, ordering me around even though you're a criminal? Because everybody's completely ignoring the fact that a clone of Sasuke is running around and can pop out of any of these marks at any given moment. But Sumire, who was on the cover of this chapter, and therefore you'd assume that she would have a somewhat big chapter, decides that her somewhat big moment in this chapter is gonna be providing some exposition to Boruto. And that's it. Sumire turns to Boruto and says, Boruto, this guy is clearly targeting Sarada. Earlier, even when Konohamaru was in front of him trying to take him down, he switched targets and tried to take down Sarada. And like, there we go. There's some useful information. Now, Sarada follows this up by saying he's planning on devouring me. At least that's what he said to me. She then says, and with those moves, it has a connection, doesn't it? To Sasuke, or Papa, as she calls him, becoming a tree. Which, like, good deductive skills, Sarada. Proud of you. Now, to this point, the Konohamaru re-enters the conversation by saying, becoming a tree? Hold on a second. You mean like what happened to Moegi? To which Boruto responds to all of them by saying this guy was formed on the basis of Sasuke's chakra. But don't pay too much attention to that. None of us have to hold back. It's not Sasuke. In fact, the only way we can get Sasuke back is taking this guy down. But apparently, since we're playing 20 questions, while Hidari is swimming around with a shark with its fin sticking out of the water, Konohamaru says, wait, how do you know all of this, Boruto? To which, thank God, Boruto checks him once again and tells Konohamaru to pay attention, because if he doesn't, he's gonna get killed. And at this point, my God, would that even be a problem for any of the readers? Oh, nice, the guy translating the chapter just finished. So now I have the whole chapter. And while Boruto is checking Konohamaru, the Akamichi reject says, hey guys, I'm picking up a chakra signature. He then yells that it's a claw grime. Boruto then tells him to calm down and tell him where it's coming from, to which he can only say, somewhere over there. And apparently somewhere over there is directly in front of Boruto. Personally, not where I would have popped up if I was a claw grime, but do you, boo? And in the next page, we see that Sarada, Sumire, Konohamaru, and Himawari are surrounded by claw grime. Boruto then says to himself, so they've come. He then tells Sarada that he'll do his best to reduce their numbers. But while he's reducing the number of the claw grimes, that Sarada should be aware of the fact that the hooded guy, or Hidari's final goal, is her. And thus she should counterattack everything that comes her way. Konohamaru then yells at Sumire to come on over to her and to get away from Boruto and Sarada, because she's not really a combatant. Like, Nue is a combatant, and Sumire was a combatant when everybody was 12, but nowadays, I don't know, I guess she's just a lab assistant. Also, where's Nue? If ever there was a time to use the remnant of the Gezo Tenno you have on your back, I feel as though now would be that time. But anyways, it's at this point that the big fight begins. As the claw grimes close in on both Sarada and Boruto, Boruto dashes towards them, slicing one down the middle and barreling towards 2 others, one of which he decapitates and one of which he cuts through the stomach in half. However, the claw grimes aren't just running at Boruto, they're also running at Sarada, and Sarada immediately senses the claw grime closing in on her, turns around and lands a kick into its chest, all the while yelling out her mother's, I guess you could call it, iconic voice line, Shanadu, but like in girl voice. However, unfortunately for Sarada, where she landed the kick in the claw grime's chest just so happened to be a claw mark, and thus out of that claw mark came a hand, and then the top half of Hidari. And it's at this point that Hidari turned his arm into roots that began to consume Sarada's leg. However, Boruto, seeing all this happen, throws a shuriken into the back of the neck of the claw grime, and then immediately uses flying Raijin to jump to said shuriken. Now, the ins and outs of Boruto's flying Raijin are still kind of a mystery to us, because the only things that we've seen him use flying Raisen to jump to up until this point were either items held by Toads or his own sword. However, Boruto throwing a shuriken and then being able to jump to that shuriken seems to confirm that he's only able to jump to items. And while that's not a crazy revelation, prior to this we believed that it was hard for him to mark items, which is why he could only specifically jump to pre-marked things, like a triangle held by a toad or his own blade. However, him throwing what appears to be a fairly standard shuriken and then jumping to it all but immediately seems to imply that he's able to leave marks on items with relative ease, but it's only on items that he has relative ease marking. And thus it's in this capacity that Boruto isn't as good with flying Raisen as his grandfather. However, none of that is hugely important right now. What is important is Boruto's able to immediately jump to basically right behind Hidari. And as he appears right behind Hidari, he lands a Rasengan into Hidari's back, which blows Hidari's entire tree hand that was grabbing Sarada clean off. However, this isn't a finishing blow, and Hidari is once again able to pop into a claw mark. And it's at this point that Sarada tells us that this is bad, he's going to recover. We then get to see Hidari standing on the black box in the Shinju headquarters that Jura was on a couple of chapters ago, and we see that as he's standing on top of it, the roots of a giant tree descend down to it. And the roots of this giant tree plug into the back of Hidari, much akin to how Madara was plugged into the Ghetto statue. And all but immediately, as these roots plug into Hidari, he's healed, which is interesting. See, this seems to imply something fairly large. See, well, obviously, we're all aware of the fact that the Shinju are actually referred to as divine trees. And while we weren't entirely aware as to why they were referred to like that, this seems to confirm to us that they are, in fact, basically just walking trees. And this is corroborated with the fact that Hidari doesn't bleed. Not when he was hit by the Chidori, and not when his arm was blown off. But the Shinju being walking divine trees is hardly the most interesting thing happening here. See, because what's happening here is very clearly a divine tree is healing other divine trees. Hidari is tapping into the power of an existing divine tree whose roots are able to rejuvenate him. See, because while previous to this moment, it just appeared as though the Shinju hideout was under some big tree or in some cave, this is implying to us that in some capacity or another, a divine tree exists and is healing the Shinju. And I can't help but feel like that somehow that's tied to the giant black box, which up until this point I just figured was an extension of Code's claw mark ability because Jura was able to lean back into it and pop out of a claw mark. But something different is at play here, and I'm not actually sure what that something different is quite yet. As to whether or not this is a divine tree that exists in a different dimension, or the proof that a divine tree exists somewhere on Earth, possibly in a somewhat failed state, or the final resting place of Shibai's body, I can't be entirely sure. But I will be making an entire video based off this idea, so, like I always say, follow the page, hit the noti bell, it'll be coming out Tuesday. The Hidari then, after getting his quick touch-up, pops out of a claw mark behind Sarada and Boruto. We then get an image of Hidari activating his Rinnegan. And rather interestingly, upon the activation of his Rinnegan, claw marks appear all over the battlefield. Now this seems to tell us that in some capacity, the Rinnegan of the Shinju is tied to the claw mark ability, which isn't the craziest concept of all time. We don't fully understand the Rinnegan, and so far as we understand, the Rinnegan does give personalized abilities to original users of the Rinnegan, like Madara with his Limbo clones, and Sasuke with his Heavenly Hand power, but this is still rather interesting, as Code, the original user of the claw marks, so far as we know, doesn't have a Rinnegan. Now after launching these claw marks all of the battlefields, Hidari once again sinks into a claw mark. And it's at this point that Sarada tells Boruto to fly into the air, and that while he's in the air, she'll keep Hidari occupied on the ground, and whenever he appears on the ground again, for Boruto to hit him with another Rasengan. But Boruto tells her, I can't. Flying isn't an option. Boruto then tells her that I'll use Uzuhiko at maximum output and finish him in one blow. And it's at this point that we finally begin to get the exposition of how Rasengan Uzuhiko works. See, Boruto tells Sarada that Rasengan Uzuhiko uses the revolution of the planet. Just kind of something we already knew. He then continues on by saying it also uses centrifugal force, which is also kind of something we already knew. See, rather aggravatingly, the exposition we get about the Rasengan Uzuhiko is kind of everything we already knew. Basically, the only useful and different exposition we get is how Boruto's able to create it in the first place. See, because Boruto goes on to say, it's a new Rasengan that I call the chakra of the planet, which seems to confirm that it's not actually senjutsu, and instead, like I originally theorized, a jutsu that quite literally uses the rotational power of the planet, because the centrifugal force of our planet spinning is massive, and thus if you're able to hone and use that power in the form of a jutsu, it would be a genuine planet buster, but unfortunately it's still not super clear. Now Sarada, upon hearing about this new jutsu, says, but can you finish him off in one hit without him receding back into his claw marks? Boruto responds by saying, I should be able to do it so long as I don't have to hold back, because after all, the power of Rasengan Uzuhiko is limitless. Now, this might be a mistranslation. After all, I am reading a fan translation here, 3 or 4 days before the official release of the manga. But it seems as though Boruto has admitted to the fact that he's able to use a jutsu with unlimited power. Now, what does unlimited power mean? At least within the scope of Rasengan Uzuhiko. Well, the next page gives us a pretty good perception of what that limitless power looks like. See, because after Boruto tells Sarada about how Rasengan Uzuhiko is limitless in its power, he tells her that he has to take in the chakra of the planet through both of his feet, which is why he can't fly right now. And therefore, if Boruto wants to take down Hidari in one hit, he's gonna have to absorb the planet's chakra directly through his 2 feet. And thus, in order to access the limitless power of Rasengan Uzuhiko, it seems as though Boruto needs to absorb a lot of chakra. And thus, this is where that limitless aspect seems to come into play. It seems as though what Boruto is telling us here is that Rasengan Uzuhiko can be as powerful as he wants it to be. The more time he has to draw in chakra into his feet, the more powerful Rasengan Uzuhiko will be. And thus, if Boruto were to have a certain amount of time, he'd be able to generate all the force of a spinning planet, which means he'd essentially be able to deliver a blow that had the mass of the planet and the speed of its rotation. Thus, since force is mass times velocity, the force delivered would be the mass of the planet that Naruto exists on times the velocity of its spinning, which would actually be much greater than a planetary level attack. See, because just one part of how this supposedly works, being able to deliver the mass of an entire planet in a punch, would be a planetary level attack. But when you times that force by the velocity of the planet spinning, then your force goes up exponentially, which is why Boruto rather aptly seems to assume that the power range of Rasengan Uzuhiko is limitless. However, there is a setup period. And thus, while Boruto is drawing in the Earth's chakra through the soles of his feet, Sarada says, so you need me to buy you some time. I'm on it. However, it's at this point that Hidari, with his Chidori activated, begins to reach a hand out of one of the claw marks near Boruto, presumably to do what he had already done to Sarada and Sumire, tase him a little bit. And while Boruto reacts to this all but immediately, so does Konohamaru. And thus, before Hidari is able to use his taser on like every police officer in the United States, Konohamaru steps in and once again uses the Rasengan upgrade that he made, Rasengan Barricade, which appears to be, in some capacity, just kind of an extension of a wind release. Except if you replace wind with spiraling chakra. But spirals generate wind. It's a wall made out of Rasengan. And thus, Konohamaru does do something useful in this chapter, so golf clap, gotta give it up. And it's at this point that Hidari's now defeated hand sinks back into a claw mark. But both Sarada and Boruto whip on over to Konohamaru, and Boruto tells Konohamaru, I told you to watch Himawari. But Konohamaru tells Boruto that I decided what I wanted to prioritize. If you want to complain, then finish your jutsu already. And it's at this point that it's revealed that the Akamichi who shall not be named is keeping an eye on Himawari, which all but confirms the thoughts that I had for how this chapter was gonna go that I posted in the last video on this channel, the video we put out Tuesday. See, I genuinely believe that after this chapter, Sarada and Boruto are gonna go to Orochimaru's caves together to train. However, with Himawari now in the arms of a sensory unit ninja from Konoha standing right beside Sumire, I believe it's rather clearly been set up that Sumire and Himawari are gonna remain in Konoha while Boruto and Sarada leave, as Himawari still has unfinished business with Jura and Team 10, and Sumire will remain in Konoha as a spy for those outside. But all the while Boruto and Konohamaru are arguing about who's keeping an eye on Himawari, Hidari once again pops out of a claw mark and this time snags Sarada from behind and begins to pull her into the claw mark. However, in a move that I really appreciate from Kishimoto, Sarada saves herself by doing the hand signs for Chidori and then electrocuting her entire body, which then obviously electrocutes Hidari, who's holding on to her. She then grabs the hand that Hidari grabbed her with and rips him out of the claw mark, tossing him into the air and directly above Boruto. To which Boruto says, to be honest, I can't say it's perfect yet, but I've got no choice. I have to use it now. And thus Boruto hadn't sucked in enough chakra through the soles of his feet to defeat Hidari in one blow, which seems to imply to me, because he had a couple of seconds to stand still and gather chakra through his feet, that if we ever wanted to approach the limitless threshold, we probably need to be like Goku with his spirit bomb. It would take a couple of minutes. But what he does muster up in just those couple of seconds is very impressive, because as Hidari's descending down towards him, Boruto unleashes Rasengan Uzuhiko. And even though Boruto doesn't believe that this Rasengan Uzuhiko would be strong enough to wipe out Hidari, it does create an upside-down tornado of force that fires into the air and covers the entire battlefield. And for a second, it appears as though that this Rasengan Uzuhiko that shouldn't have been enough to kill Hidari was. As we see, all that's left of Hidari is one fragment of his cloak. However, in actuality, Boruto had just effectively blown Hidari in half, as the top half of Hidari began to descend from the top of the upside-down tornado. Oh, and by the way, it feels important to note, now that I've seen what Rasengan Uzuhiko is capable of, it's absolutely tied to Shibai. One of the only images we've ever gotten of Shibai, he is surrounded by a giant torrent of force. And while he's floating while surrounded by this giant torrent of force, it looks eerily similar to the Rasengan Uzuhiko that Boruto just fired off. That is to say that a spiral of what appears to either be fire or chakra is surrounding Shibai. And while ever since we saw Rasengan Uzuhiko in, I believe, chapter 2, this theory has existed, I believe this chapter has completely 100% cemented the fact that Rasengan Uzuhiko and its limitless power is tied to Shibai. I mean, wouldn't that make sense? In the same chapter that we're revealing this jutsu has unlimited power, it's being confirmed that it's tied to the person with unlimited power. And thus the reason that Boruto learned Rasengan Uzuhiko and learned how to tap into the rotation of a planet is most likely tied to his Jogan. But we'll be doing a deeper dive on that theory and really getting into the nitty-gritty on Thursday, so follow and hit the noti bell. I haven't had this much to talk about in a chapter of Boruto in a long time. However, as half of Hidari is now descending towards the ground, he's about to land on a field of claw marks that he can just pop himself into and be healed once again. However, just as he's about to get close enough to pop into them, all of the claw marks shrink. And it's at this point that half of Hidari hits the ground and is laying there, now defenseless. And thus Kawaki decides to take this opportunity to make the entire battle about himself and only swing in when it truly doesn't matter at all. Well, I guess it does kind of matter. He did shrink the claw marks and Boruto may not have gotten there in time, so Hidari would have been able to heal. But anyways, Kawaki then flies in against the defenseless Hidari and pins his body against the ground. He then delivers a relatively cold one-liner when he says, "Hey, you look like you're in pain. I'll fix that," and then blows away Hidari. We then cut to a bird's eye view as we see Kawaki standing over a crater where Hidari used to be, and both Sumire and Konohamaru look on as Konohamaru says, yes, he did it. We then get a panel of Kawaki standing amongst the ashes that were once Hidari. However, amongst those ashes appears something akin to a chakra fruit, a black, tiny, fist-sized chakra fruit with spikes coming out of the top and the bottom and a Rinnegan in the base. Boruto immediately snags this, what is presumably core of a Shinju, out of the air, and Kawaki looks at him and asks what it is. To this point, the Boruto says, "What do you think? Is this the right thing?" At which point, a toad crawls out of his cloak. We then cut back to Kashinkoji, who's still in one of Orochimaru's caves, as he says, "Object confirmed. There's no mistaking it. It's the same as what I saw. The Soul Thorn." Now, this is curious for a couple of reasons. One, why has Kashinkoji seen a Soul Thorn before? And two, what's a Soul Thorn? I mean, rather obviously, just using context here. The Soul Thorn is the part of the Shinju that holds on to the soul and chakra of the person who they turned into a tree. And thus, I'm assuming if hypothetically you return this Soul Thorn to the person who's trapped in a tree, they'll be free. But that doesn't necessarily answer the question of why Kashinkoji has seen a Soul Thorn before, which could be answered in one of two ways. Either somehow Kashinkoji has the future sight of the Great Toad Sage, or he's defeated a Shinju prior. And both of those are massively interesting possibilities. And both of them are possibilities we're going to explore in our Sunday video, so go ahead and follow the page and hit the noti bell. Now, Kawaki, not to be uninvolved from anything for too long, immediately goes up to Boruto and puts his hand on his chest and says, "Hey, wait. What is that thing?" To which Boruto responds by saying, "It's something that I need to return my master back into a human from a tree." Or so I've heard, which basically confirms the fact that Kashinkoji has been feeding Boruto all the information that he needs to know about the Shinju. After this, Boruto says, "If you understand that, Kawaki, let me go. If you don't, I'll cut off your arm." And my God, do I believe him. Kawaki then says, "Who did you hear this from? Who's your informant?" Which presumably would have gotten the answer of, "Oh, there goes your right arm," except for the fact that Trump's would-be assassin apparently double booked this weekend. Because right as Boruto is about to make sure that Kawaki loses his arm for a second time, he gets shot straight through the chest. However, rather interestingly though, he gets shot through the right side of his chest. Right about here, which is, after all, about 3 or 4 inches from his heart. So nobody can hit a fatal shot nowadays, apparently. Now, naturally, this stuns everybody into silence, both Sarada and Sumire, and Boruto falls to the ground while spitting up blood. And while Boruto is falling over, Sarada is sprinting to his side, and Sumire, complete statue. In fact, even Konohamaru gets to his side before Sumire even starts moving. Now, to this point, the Kawaki checks in with Delta and asks what's going on over there. And it's at this point that we see that Jura is still in the same position he was earlier, but now he's taking shots. You see, Jura is miles from Konoha, maybe more, because not only is Konoha not visible from where he's flying, we don't even see forest. Jura could have taken the shot at Boruto from dozens of miles away. However, even though he can't even see Boruto, he laments at the fact that he missed his vitals and begins to warm up another tailed beast sniper shot with his Rinnegan eye. Now, Delta just stares in awe as she can't believe that this guy's actually taking shots at Konoha from where they are. And it's at this point that Sarada realizes that Boruto dropped the Soul Thorn, so she runs to go grab it. However, apparently either the tailed beast balls fly at an incredible rate, or Jura anticipated this was going to happen, because as soon as Sarada goes to reach for the Soul Thorn, a tailed beast bullet goes straight through her arm. And that is absurd. If we're assuming no precognition here, that means in the time that it took for Sarada, a fully trained ninja, to get up and try to traverse 3 feet to the Soul Thorn, Jura lined up, fired a shot, and had the shot land. We are talking about a second, maybe a second and a half, that a shot was lined up, fired, and landed from possibly dozens of miles away. Now, this wouldn't be a light speed feat. Light travels at 1 mile every 5.3 microseconds. In fact, light travels from the Earth to the Moon in about 1.5 seconds. And I'll tell you right now that Jura is not the Earth and the Moon distance away from Konoha. But this is still a wildly impressive feat that scales Jura substantially higher. And at this point that the Soul Thorn decides, yeah, I don't really want to be manhandled anymore, and gets up and flies away, all the way back to Jura, who, when it comes back to him, says, dang, that Boruto, he knows about Soul Thorns. That makes him a bigger threat than even I presumed. He then continues by saying, well then, Kawaki is more than enough food for the 10 tails. I guess I'll just kill Boruto. And with that, the chapter ends. Exactly as I anticipated, because after all, I told everybody that Hidari wasn't going to be defeated in this chapter. If you go back and watch the video I watched 2 days ago, I fully hypothesized that Kawaki was going to fly into the battle between Boruto and Hidari, and his presence would serve as the opportunity for Himawari and Boruto to once again be separated, and that the conclusion of the battle between Boruto and Hidari would either result in Boruto retreating with the likes of Sarada, or Hidari having to retreat either because Sasuke is breaking out of him, or because he was defeated mildly. And while I wouldn't say this defeat for Hidari is mild, he's still retreated. He's still going to be an entity in the story. And thus the stage has 100% been set for Sarada and Boruto going off to an Orochimaru cave with Kashin Koji to train and get stronger. And possibly that'll happen because Boruto will tell Kawaki to keep an eye on Himawari, and he'll keep an eye on Sarada, because the resources of Konoha in terms of strength are not great enough to stop two Shinju from acquiring their targets. And thus Himawari will link up with Team 10 as a replacement for Inojin, and they will have the logical conclusion to their battle against Jura, and Boruto and Sarada will team up together with possibly the likes of Orochimaru and Kashin Koji to battle against Hidari. Is at least what I believe we'll see in chapter 13. But who knows? Nothing's been confirmed yet. But I'm curious to hear from you guys. Do you have any theories that spun out of this chapter? Why do you believe Hidari was able to be healed by the Divine Tree? Tell me in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. I got some theories to crack into.